What a time to be you and on your desk. Should we start with SpaceX? You know, to so many participants in this market, it presages this great IPO year. Is that what you expect?
I think that's exactly right. If you rewind the clock and you look back to just March of this year when I was last here with you, we were talking about the fact that the first of the big ones to go out will be SpaceX, and that this year's activity will be driven by the mega cap private companies that are now going public. And we had that in SpaceX. And again, if you rewind the clock and we think about the conversation you and I had back in March, we were talking about the fact that I believed that SpaceX would perform well. And I think we're sitting here today, not quite a week into their trading, saying, oh, SpaceX is performing as expected.
Mr. Reagan just raised some really interesting points, which is like, it's not just IPOs. Generally, this market could be flooded with equity. It's not universal that it's a good time to go public. I spoke to Ali Ghodsi, the Databricks CEO, very recently. Here's his take.
3 mega IPOs that have been rumored. One of them happened. So letting those kind of go through the system and see how that sort of plays out and things stabilize a little bit. I stand by what I said. I think for most other companies, it's probably best to wait it out.
You know, I think Wellington's on the cap table of Databricks, right? But that's one view, right? There's so much will happen that Databricks might not for that reason.
Yeah, there's a lot in the pipe. There's a lot coming down. But I think what the precipice tipping point will be for the next batch of companies will be how these first 3, the 3 mega ones that we talk about, how they perform. And I believe the subsequent 2 that are coming will likely perform very similar to SpaceX, which is with a lot of enthusiasm, not just from retail investors, but also from institutional investors. And I think that is the setup that the next batch of companies, maybe a Databricks as an example, would be looking for before they decide to come to the market.
Just purely as case studies, you know, if Anthropic and OpenAI go next, that what they've said in their limited ability to speak publicly is an IPO is the only mechanism to raise capital at the levels they need. Find that really confusing because, you know, they both did such ginormous private rounds so recently. The private market seems very willing to support that growth.
The private market is. There's just not sufficient capital to support the capital intensity, as we were just hearing about, of these model companies in perpetuity. And the private markets do not offer enough liquidity for the investors in these businesses to ultimately get liquid without ultimately going public. And to put that in kind of understandable terms, the private market transacts in a full year what the public market transacts in a week. And so the volume of liquidity available to public market companies is dramatically different to what's available on the private side.
How much are private market investors in these leading frontier labs now needing to model for and take into account political risks? I'm talking, of course, about the administration's intervention in certain use of technology, but it's not just the US, right? We're talking about jurisdictions like the EU.
I think that it is a factor that people are now starting to incorporate in their thinking for how some of these technologies will evolve. And I think it's a big open question mark as to what the future of the model builders, as an example, looks like with respect to regulatory action. But what I do feel confident that it is in everybody's interest, the model builders themselves, as well as the governments, to support and ultimately enable this. Because if the United States or China or the governmental agencies are not promoting this, we will be left behind and we will give up the advantages that are accruing to the top builders today. So I think it will resolve. It's a question of how it resolves.
Matt, I'd really appreciate your insight here, even if the answer is no. How closely did you read the SpaceX prospectus, the story they were trying to tell, and then extrapolate out to how that might apply to everyone else, OpenAI, Anthropic, Databricks? You know, it was so interesting to see their TAM numbers and how they see the world in the very distant future.
I would say that SpaceX is unique, and SpaceX is unique because Elon Musk is unique. And so when I think about the SpaceX SpaceX story and I think about the market cap that SpaceX is currently trading at, I think people are willing to, for Elon, say, I believe in your vision of the future, and I believe you, Elon, can deliver on that vision. And I would say that is a relatively unique place in the market. There are not many other entrepreneurs or CEOs I can think of who could go out and tell a story that's 5, 10 years out in the future and get credit for that story today. So I think when you think about the model builders going out as the next generation or the next IPO candidates, I think those companies will more likely trade on fundamentals than maybe where SpaceX is trading today, which is, again, a little bit of the Elon magic dust around ability to convince the world that he will be the person who gets us into the future.